Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughn Manor. And today, it's my Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I talk about a Marvel Epic collection, and Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same Marvel Epic collection. And this week, we're talking about Daredevil in our world's finest team up. The Daredevil Epic collection I'm talking about today is this one, A Touch of Typhoid. This is Daredevil Volume 13. These stories took place in 1988 through 1989. This has Daredevil 253 through 270 and Punisher number 10. This is an interesting little run of Daredevil. It came after Frank Miller reinvented the character. And pretty much after Frank Miller reinvented Daredevil, Daredevil was a much different comic book. Frank Miller really took a superhero character and put him in a crime comic book, made everything very gritty and dark. Frank Miller famously created Elektra. Frank Miller's run was great. None of his run is in Epic Collections, though, because it's been reprinted everywhere else, and it's pretty easy to get. And I do urge you to pick up Frank Miller's Daredevil if you never have. This took place after that, and this is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's interesting because of the story. It's interesting because of the artwork. The story is by Ann Nocenti, and I have mixed feelings about the story. I also have mixed feelings about this character, Typhoid Mary. It's kind of fun to read Typhoid Mary now, read The Touch of Typhoid Mary now, because this is a very 80s comic book, a very late 80s comic book. Very gritty and morally gray. There are good things and bad things about Nocenti's writing in this. She does take Matt Murdock into some interesting places. And she comes up with some interesting situations and stories. And there's some great action in this book. On the other hand, it does, I think, sometimes make Matt Murdock act in uncharacteristic ways. His whole relationship with Mary and Typhoid Mary is problematic. The character of Typhoid Mary is pretty problematic now. Typhoid Mary is an assassin working for Kingpin. Kingpin's in this, of course, because it's a Daredevil comic book in the 80s, so Kingpin has to be in there every 5 seconds. And Kingpin's really pissed at this point because he can't get rid of Matt Murdock. He's done everything he can to get rid of Daredevil, and he just can't do it. So now he's trying this. And Typhoid Mary now it would be dissociative identity disorder is what you would call it now, I believe. At the time, I think it was just multiple personality disorder, although I could be wrong. It might have already been dissociative identity disorder then. I can't remember, and I don't know. Nevertheless, she had a mental illness, Typhoid Mary. And it's not handled with any sensitivity at all. Of course, because it's the 80s. Basically, Typhoid Mary is basically a femme fatale, using her wiles and sexual allure to go up against Daredevil and Matt Murdock in two different ways. Matt Murdock should have handled this better, let us say, our friend Matt Murdock. And this at times feels like a cross between a crime story and kind of a soap opera, kind of like a soap opera. It felt that way to me. Very often it kind of ranges into kind of cheap soap opera territory. For me, a little too much. I mean, you always do that in Marvel Comics, but this really does, I feel like. There's a lot of... It's the 80s, so they had to throw a bunch of sex and violence in it, which is fine for Daredevil. It works for Daredevil. Problem is, in the 80s, they had to throw that in everything. But in Daredevil, that kind of thing works. It's kind of at home, that kind of gritty storytelling. you kind of expect Matt Murdock to rise above it all. Doesn't always. So yeah, I find the story, it's kind of up and down for me. Her run is kind of up and down for me. There are things I liked about it, things I didn't like about it. The dialogue, for example, doesn't really work, especially as I was reading it now. As an older person, I was like, wow, some of this just doesn't sound like anything any human being would ever say in real life. You get that a lot in comic books, but for some reason it really stuck out here. Maybe it's because I remembered it differently from when I first read these stories. But of course, the thing I remembered most is the artwork. And the artwork was fantastic. John Romita Jr., whose father was the greatest Spider-Man artist of all time, he had a lot to live up to, and he had kind of a rough start, but by the time he got on Daredevil, he drew a lot of characters. By the time he got on Daredevil, he was really, really good. Some of the artwork in here is just fantastic, or at least interesting. Got Daredevil there. Now, Typhoid Mary, there she is. There's no doubt when this comic book was made. That's a very 1988 character right there with the hair and the outfit. Very of its time, this comic book, I feel like, especially reading it now. Not all the art was done by John Romita Jr. Got her cover there with her ridiculous hair everywhere. There was an issue of the Punisher in here somewhere. Just excellent stuff. I like the way he sets up panels and puts together his action. He's really excellent in this, and I feel like his work just gets better throughout. But then, of course, you're interrupted by this Punisher issue with I never knew how to pronounce this guy's name. Whilce Portacio. I think it's Whilce Portacio. I could be wrong. But he did the Punisher, and I never really cared for his artwork too much. He had a poor grasp of anatomy, and some of his panel designs were awkward, to say the least. Some of his fight scenes were, I don't know. Awkward is the best way to come up with my feelings for this guy, as far as the way his panels are designed, his page layout, his everything. Kind of awkward for me. Never really cared for him, especially when you compare him to John Romita Jr.'s work, which comes right after. He does a great Punisher, and you have this great scene where the Punisher's fighting Daredevil. That's just excellent. The layout, how the artwork is done, it's really cool. Excellent stuff. This is a very Frank Miller scene right there. Yeah, that's pretty cool. That all works. That all works really well. And but then you've got, I think pretty much the only good art in here is from John Romita Jr., unfortunately. And you've got some Ron Lim in here, and that's okay for the most part. Ron Lim's okay, but if you compare to the stuff that Ron Lim did in this particular issue, with the stuff that Romita Jr. was doing, there's really no comparison, especially as this book goes on. Towards the end of the book, it gets really interesting. When Anna Senti decided that since Daredevil's already been through hell, let's literally put him through hell. And Mephisto shows up. You do have an interesting guest appearance by the Human Torch, which is a little odd. But fun, as always. Yeah. Trying to find a picture of the Human Torch in here, but I'm... Oh, there he is. Here I am. I'm the Human Torch. pretty cool stuff. Like I said, interesting panel and page layouts. Towards the end of this story, monsters. Look at that. That's pretty cool. Towards the end of this epic collection, it gets really interesting with the art. As you can see, right there, there's just some crazy stuff that starts showing up in this book. I mean, just look at that. These are some of the pages that I remember so well. They're very striking, very well done. Everything about the page is really interesting. And then, unfortunately, there are a couple like filler issues in this. It's an epic collection, so they collect everything. And so you're getting issue 264. Look at that cover. This little child has the unfortunate superpower of mega farts or super farts. It looks like it's an unfortunate cover design. I'm not sure what they were thinking there. And then you open it up and you get this. And that was Steve Ditko. The great Steve Ditko, who used to do Spider-Man, the co-creator of Spider-Man. I think that they just needed somebody who could work quick, because this is a very rushed issue and the artwork is pretty terrible throughout this entire issue. Normally, when it's the Steve Ditko issue that looks bad, which this one just looks terrible, I blame the inker, and the inking is bad here, but I can't blame the inker for this. I don't know if at this point in Steve Ditko's career, very late in his career, if he had just lost it, or just didn't care, or more likely, the most likely of all is that he just was rushed. This was a last minute job, I'm hoping, and he just had to rush it out. But really, I think for him, Marvel Comics at this point was just work for hire, and so you get stuff that looks like that. Not great. It's unfortunate, especially when you follow it up with John Romita Jr. Boy, can you tell the difference. And we get some great moments at the end of this issue here when Mephisto shows up looking crazy. I mean, look at that. That's fantastic. That's just, this whole back part of the book is really, really interesting and has some great artwork. And it's really worth it just for the art alone, although the story becomes a lot more interesting towards the end as well. That's pretty much the Matt Murdock we recognize after Frank Miller. We get some mutants in here. The Blob shows up, as well as some others, and we get some great pieces of art there. That's just really cool. Look at that. And then one of the characters that John Romita Jr. did so well was actually Spider-Man. And fortunately, he doesn't really try to emulate his father or draw like his father when his Spider-Man shows up. And this is the Blackheart. A great monster shows up in here. Daredevil fights some characters you're just not used to seeing. You're not used to seeing this kind of stuff in Daredevil, you know. It's interesting stuff to show up in this comic book. You got a great shot there. That's just so cool. Look at that. Great work. Have a really, really interesting fight scene here. So this epic collection really concludes strong, and there he is. There's Spider-Man. Look at the way he does Spider-Man. He just does a fantastic job with his character. That character just looks great, Spider-Man does. Always fun. There's such a good team, Spider-Man and Daredevil, these two street-level heroes. Although Spider-Man's like 9 gazillion times stronger than Daredevil. You can really see how strong Spider-Man is when he's hanging out with a regular guy. Because Daredevil, you know, he has this great training and strength. he has this great training and skill, is what I should say, but his strength is no more than a regular human. And so when you're hanging out with Spider-Man, you can really just see how tough Spider-Man is. And he really needed Spider-Man at this moment. He needed Spider-Man's strength against this character. And like I said, Spider-Man just looks great. Look at that. So for me, I really liked this one. I liked it when I first read it, although reading it now, I see many of the flaws I didn't see then. It seemed really sophisticated when I was younger, when I read this. You know, when I was 17 and 18 years old. This seemed really sophisticated and adult. Seems less so now. A lot of the flaws in the writing and in the story and in the characterization. Matt Murdock acting in some ways, I'm not sure Matt Murdock should have acted. He seemed to let himself go astray a little easily in this, but that's okay. You know, he has to be reborn once again in this because, you know, that's just how it goes with Matt Murdock. But the artwork in this is rock solid as far as John Romita Jr. is concerned. It's worth it just for that. So the story's interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. It's an interesting little time capsule from the late 80s. With its gritty style and morally gray characters and crazy Typhoid Mary. And it's interesting. It was an interesting time, and it was an interesting time on this book. It's not revolutionary the way Frank Miller's Daredevil was revolutionary, but still really interesting. And the artwork is fantastic. And so it was fun to see John Romita Jr. Develop as an artist, which he really did at this period. So there you go. Daredevil, A Touch of Typhoid. Tune in to Steve Donoghue's channel and see what he has to say later on today. I'm sure he'll have some interesting thoughts on this run. That'll be fun to watch. I think he likes John Romita Jr. and I can't see how he wouldn't like the artwork in this, but as for the rest, that'll be interesting to hear. Okay, guys, I will catch you here next time. Bye, guys.